Why a narcissist never really recovers after betraying a superempath. Before we go any further, I want to slow down on that word, can't, because it's carrying a lot of weight in that opening line, and it deserves to be unpacked before we build the rest of this conversation on top of it. When people hear the word can't, they usually imagine something absolute. They think of impossibility, as if a person lacks the ability in the same way someone without sight cannot see colors or someone without wings cannot fly. But in psychology, especially when we talk about narcissistic personality patterns, the word can't is far more nuanced than that. It doesn't always mean a complete absence of capacity. More often, it describes a mind that has become so organized around self-protection that certain emotional experiences become extraordinarily difficult to access. The potential may still exist somewhere beneath layers of defense, but reaching it would require confronting fears, shame, and vulnerabilities that the person has spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Think about how the human mind adapts after repeated emotional injuries. If a child grows up believing that showing fear leads to humiliation, that child may eventually stop expressing fear altogether. From the outside, it can appear as though they no longer feel afraid. In reality, the fear never disappeared. It simply became buried beneath coping strategies designed to keep it out of awareness. The same principle applies to many narcissistic defenses. When we say a narcissist can't tolerate criticism, can't maintain genuine emotional intimacy, or can't consistently show empathy, we're not necessarily saying those capacities never existed. We're saying that using those capacities may threaten the psychological structure that allows them to feel emotionally safe. This distinction matters because it prevents us from falling into two equally misleading extremes. The first extreme is believing narcissists are simply evil people making conscious, calculated choices every second of every day. While some manipulative behaviors are certainly intentional, many defensive reactions happen automatically. The mind has rehearsed them so many times that they become almost reflexive. Blame, denial, projection, grandiosity, and emotional withdrawal often activate long before conscious reflection has a chance to intervene. The second extreme is assuming that because these behaviors originate as defenses, they should automatically be excused. Understanding is not the same as excusing. A person's psychological history may explain why they hurt others, but it does not erase the impact of that harm or remove their responsibility for addressing it. That's why the word can't deserves careful handling. It sits somewhere between inability and unwillingness. In many cases, a narcissistic individual experiences intense internal resistance to behaviors that require vulnerability, accountability, or emotional openness. Those experiences can feel psychologically dangerous, even when no actual danger exists. Imagine asking someone with severe social anxiety to stand on a crowded stage and deliver a speech. Technically, they possess the physical ability to do it. Their vocal cords work, their legs function, yet their nervous system reacts as though they're facing a life-threatening event. Saying they can't give the speech captures the reality of their experience, even though the limitation is psychological rather than physical. Similarly, when a narcissistic person is asked to admit fault, genuinely apologize, tolerate rejection, or sit with feelings of inadequacy, their emotional system may react with overwhelming distress. To protect itself, the mind often reaches for familiar defenses instead. It shifts blame, rewrites events, attacks the other person, minimizes the issue, or emotionally disconnects. From the outside, these reactions may appear cold, arrogant, or deliberately cruel. Internally, however, they are frequently attempts to escape emotional pain that feels unbearable. That doesn't lessen the consequences for those around them, but it helps explain why these patterns can become so repetitive and resistant to change. This is also why lasting change is exceptionally difficult. Changing a habit is one thing. Changing an entire psychological survival system is something else entirely. It requires the person to face emotions they have spent years, sometimes decades, avoiding. It requires acknowledging painful truths about themselves without collapsing into shame or rushing back to defensive patterns. Some people are willing to undertake that work, especially when they develop genuine self-awareness and commit to long-term therapy. Others never reach that point because the very defenses protecting their self-image also prevent them from recognizing the need to change in the first place. So as we continue this discussion, I want you to hold on to this distinction. When we say a narcissist can't do something emotionally, we're rarely talking about a simple lack of ability. We're talking about a deeply conditioned psychological system that treats vulnerability as a threat and protection as a necessity. Understanding that difference doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does allow us to see these patterns with greater clarity, less confusion, and far more psychological accuracy. I don't mean can't the way someone can't lift something too heavy or can't solve a problem because they don't have the right tools. I mean can't in the way a person can't unsee something once they've seen it, can't unfeel something once it has already landed inside them, can't go back to being the version of themselves that existed before one particular encounter permanently rearranged their internal world without ever asking permission to do so. A narcissist who betrays a superempath does not walk away clean. They don't move on the way they've moved on from everyone before her. They don't just find the next person and slide effortlessly back into the pattern that has always worked for them in the past. Something happens after this specific kind of betrayal that catches the narcissist completely off guard, something they can't fully explain even to themselves. And that something is what this entire conversation is really about. It's worth sitting with how unusual this is, because for most of their life, the narcissist has operated on a kind of psychological autopilot. Relationships begin, they extract what they need, the relationship ends on their terms, or close enough to their terms, and the story gets filed away in a version that keeps their self-image intact. This has worked more or less every single time. It's the operating system they've run on for years, maybe decades. So when something interrupts that system, when the usual mechanisms fail to fully do their job, it's not a small glitch. It's closer to a system failure, one they don't have the language or the self-awareness to properly diagnose. They just know something is different and they don't know why, and they will spend an enormous amount of energy trying not to look directly at it. So if you've ever been a superempath on the receiving end of a narcissist's worst behavior, and you watch them seemingly sail off into their next chapter completely untouched, stay with me here, because underneath that surface, something far more complicated is happening. It's one of the most psychologically fascinating and quietly devastating processes you'll find anywhere in relationship dynamics. And it's something the narcissist is desperately hoping you never figure out. Let's start with the superempath, because you can't really grasp what the narcissist loses without first understanding exactly what this kind of person is. Not in the loose, watered-down way the term tends to get used, but in a precise sense that explains why this particular person is categorically different from every other target the narcissist has ever chosen. A superempath isn't just someone who feels things deeply. Plenty of empaths feel deeply. What sets the superempath apart isn't only the depth of their emotion, it's the combination of that depth with something the narcissist never expected to run into in someone they picked. A backbone, a level of self-awareness that runs just as deep as the empathy itself. The ability to absorb, understand, and truly feel the full weight of someone else's psychology, including their darkness, their manipulation, their carefully built false self, and to hold all of that clearly and accurately without losing themselves inside of it forever. The superempath isn't someone who never gets hurt. They get hurt profoundly, arguably more profoundly than most people, precisely because of how completely they feel everything around them. But they also carry a capacity for reckoning that eventually catches up to whatever was done to them. And when it does, when their perception finally crystallizes fully around what the narcissist actually is, what was real and what was constructed, the quality of that seeing is unlike anything the narcissist has ever been seen with before. It's complete, it's accurate, there's no sentimentality left clinging to it, and it lands on the narcissist in a way that nothing else in their life ever has. Here's something the narcissist has understood, consciously or not, about every relationship before this one. Most people, when a narcissist hurts them, walk away with their perception of that narcissist still somewhat intact. They leave confused. Some version of the relationship's mythology keeps running quietly in the background. The idea that underneath everything that went wrong, there was still something real there, something worth the pain, some genuine version of the person they fell for that circumstances simply didn't allow to fully surface. They leave with just enough uncertainty about what actually happened that the narcissist retains the power to rewrite the story, to become the victim of the ending rather than the one who caused the damage, to build a version of events, at least in the circles that matter to them, where the person who left was unstable or difficult or just not the right match. That ability to rewrite isn't a minor thing for a narcissist. It's essential. The ability to control the narrative around every ending, to never be the clear villain of any story, to always have some version of events available that protects the self-image they cannot survive without. This is how narcissists move through their relational history without ever accumulating the kind of accountability that would force real change in them. Every ending that can be spun into something else is an ending that costs them nothing at the psychological level that actually matters. Think about how much this narrative control actually does for them over the course of a lifetime. It lets them walk into new relationships without carrying the weight of the old ones. It lets them present themselves to friends, family, even therapists as someone who has simply had bad luck or been misunderstood or fallen for the wrong people over and over again. It protects them from the one thing their entire psychological structure is built to avoid at all costs, which is a clear, external, undeniable reflection of who they actually are. As long as every ending remains a little bit murky, a little bit up for interpretation, they retain control over their own story. And control over the story is, in a very real sense, control over the self they get to keep believing in. The superempath doesn't leave that way. When a superempath finally reaches the end of what she can tolerate in a relationship with a narcissist, and it's always a process, never a sudden snap, always the slow accumulation of evidence that the person she's with simply isn't capable of what the relationship demands, what she carries with her on the way out isn't confusion, it's clarity. A specific, complete, deeply unflattering clarity about exactly what the narcissist is, exactly how the manipulation worked, exactly which moments were real and which were performance, exactly what she was chosen for, and exactly how she was used. That clarity is built from the very same perceptive machinery that made her so appealing to the narcissist in the first place. The ability to read people at depth, to understand what's driving them beneath the surface they present to the world, to track patterns over time with an accuracy most people never develop. The narcissist spent the entire relationship benefiting from being understood that well. What they never anticipated was that the same understanding would eventually turn itself toward the full picture of what they actually did and produce a verdict that leaves absolutely no room for revision. And this verdict, this quiet, devastatingly accurate, completely unsentimental understanding of exactly who the narcissist is and exactly what they did, is what the narcissist is left holding when the superempath walks away. Not her presence, not her warmth, or her depth, or her extraordinary ability to make someone feel truly known in a way nothing else compares to. What they're left with is the knowledge that someone saw them all the way through, past the charm, past the construction, past the carefully maintained false self. Past the love bombing, the gaslighting, the narrative control, all the way down to what was actually there underneath it all. And what was there was seen clearly, held accurately, understood completely, and still found insufficient. Still found worth leaving. The narcissist has been rejected before, they've been left before, but they've almost never been seen before, not like this, not with this kind of accuracy. And rejection that comes after being fully seen and still not chosen operates on a completely different level than any rejection they've experienced up to that point. It doesn't just sting the ego the way previous endings did. It cuts somewhere deeper, somewhere the narcissist has spent their whole life building elaborate structures to protect. That terrifying, never examined, always defended core question underneath everything. Am I actually enough? Is there something genuinely worth knowing underneath everything I perform for the world? And the superempath's exit, carrying that clear-eyed verdict with her, answers that question in a way the narcissist cannot argue with, cannot reframe into something more comfortable, cannot spin, because she saw too much, too clearly for any spin to hold, even in the narcissist's own private version of events. This is where the inability to recover truly begins. Because every coping mechanism a narcissist has ever successfully used after a relationship ends depends on a certain amount of flexibility in the story. It requires that what happened can be reshaped, at least partially, into something that reflects well on them, or at the very least, neutrally. But the superempath leaves carrying the real story with her. Not an exaggerated, bitter, emotionally reactive version of events, the accurate one. And the narcissist knows it's accurate. That's exactly what makes it impossible to fully dismiss, even in private, even in the moments when no one else is watching and the performance of being fine gets quietly switched off. In those moments, the knowledge that someone understood precisely what they were doing and chose to leave anyway arrives without the usual cushioning that denial provides. Because her clarity doesn't leave room for the narcissist to convince even themselves that it was a misunderstanding, that they were misread. That if she'd just seen them a little differently, things would have turned out another way. She saw them correctly. The outcome reflects exactly that. And alone with that reality, in the quiet moments they can't fill with distraction, the narcissist runs into something they have no established way of processing. What they find in those quiet moments and what it ends up doing to every relationship they try to build afterward, and why the pattern that has always reliably rebuilt their ego in the past suddenly stops fully working this time. That's the part of the story that actually explains why betraying a superempath is the one thing a narcissist truly cannot walk away from unchanged. And that's exactly where we're headed next. What they find in those quiet moments, the thing the narcissist works harder than almost anyone realizes to avoid ever sitting inside of, doesn't really have a comfortable name in the vocabulary of someone who has spent their entire life avoiding self-examination. It isn't guilt, not in the way a person with a fully developed conscience experiences guilt, with that accompanying pull toward accountability, toward making things right, toward genuinely wishing they had been different. It's something more disorienting than guilt, and in a lot of ways more corrosive, because it sits closer to recognition. A recognition that shows up without any of the machinery of empathy that would let them process it in a healthy way, without the self-awareness that would let them do anything useful with it, without the emotional tools that would let them fold it into some coherent understanding of who they are and what actually needs to change. It arrives instead as raw, unprocessed knowing, sitting right in the center of them with nowhere to go. The knowing that the one person who understood them completely, not the performed version, not the charming version, not the version built specifically to draw admiration and supply, but the one person who saw all the way down to what was actually there, looked at it and decided it wasn't something she could stay for. And unlike everyone who left before her, she can't be written off as someone who simply didn't understand him well enough. She understood him better than anyone ever had. That was the entire problem. And that problem doesn't just fade away on its own. So what does the narcissist actually do with all of this? Because a narcissist without some kind of coping strategy simply doesn't exist. They will always reach for something, always find some mechanism for managing whatever can't be integrated. And the first thing they reach for, the way they always reach for it first, is replacement. The familiar logic that one person's absence can be resolved by another person's presence. And they usually find someone fairly quickly because their ability to attract people hasn't diminished one bit. The charm still works. The love bombing still lands. The early stage of a new relationship still delivers that hit of admiration and attention that temporarily quiets the noise underneath. For a while, maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, this replacement strategy seems to work exactly the way it always has. They feel that familiar forward momentum of a new dynamic, the relief of having supply again, the comfortable reset, a fresh start with someone new has always provided before. But something is different this time, underneath the surface of that new relationship. In the private experience only the narcissist has access to. When the newness settles down enough for comparison to creep in, the new person just doesn't see him the way she did. And strangely, despite the fact that being seen that clearly is exactly what exposed him and ultimately contributed to his undoing, the absence of that same depth of seeing in the new relationship creates a flatness he wasn't prepared for. A low-grade dissatisfaction sitting underneath the supply like static underneath music. Always there, always quietly ruining the experience, impossible to fully tune out. This is the specific trap the betrayed superempath leaves the narcissist inside of. And it isn't something she designed or intended or is sitting somewhere orchestrating with any kind of satisfaction. It's simply the natural consequence of having been a certain quality of presence in someone's life. Because the superempath, for all the pain of the relationship, for all the ways the dynamic was broken, for all the cost that landed almost entirely on her, also gave the narcissist something he has received from no one else and will never quite receive from anyone else in the same way. The experience of being genuinely, deeply, accurately known. Not flattered, not idealized, not performing for an audience that only ever sees the surface, actually known. And that experience, even coming from someone he exploited and weaponized and ultimately couldn't tolerate the accountability of, leaves a mark. Because the human need to be known isn't reserved only for people with healthy psychologies. The narcissist has that need too, buried under layer after layer of defense and performance and the elaborate false self built to protect the wound underneath it all. He has it, and it has almost never been met, because the kind of knowing she brought to the relationship requires the person being known to actually be willing to be seen. And he has spent his entire life engineering the exact opposite of that, except with her, somehow, briefly, imperfectly, terrifyingly, he was seen anyway. And now that it's gone, its absence is louder than he expected, louder than anything the new supply can drown out. Now here's where the inability to recover shifts from being about losing this one specific person into being about something the narcissist carries with him into everything that comes after. Because the recognition that showed up in those quiet moments, the raw, unprocessed knowing about himself, that her clear-eyed exit left somewhere he can't reach in order to remove it, starts doing something he has no framework for handling. It starts leaking into the performance itself. Not visibly, not in ways new people without any context would immediately notice, but in small private ways he registers with a discomfort he can't quite name. The love bombing feels a little more mechanical than it used to. Building the false self takes a little more effort than it used to. The moments right after a successful manipulation, which used to produce a clean hit of satisfaction, now produce something murkier, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. Something that asks a question he has no interest in answering, but also can't fully silence. Her clarity, the understanding she carried out of the relationship about exactly what he was doing and how and why, has somehow lodged itself inside his own experience of doing it. She saw the mechanism so completely, so accurately, that now some part of him can't fully unsee it from the inside either. The trick doesn't work as cleanly anymore when some part of you is aware, against your own will, that it is in fact a trick. This is psychological territory the narcissist has never occupied before, and he has no map for it. Every previous relationship he left or ended or destroyed at the very least left his ability to move forward as himself completely intact. The performed self, the constructed self, the self that has been working reliably in the world for as long as he can remember. What happened with her has compromised that ability in a way he can't fully repair, not destroyed it. A narcissist's defenses are formidable, the false self is resilient, and the capacity for denial runs deep and wide, but compromised, slightly cracked, and a crack in the foundation of a structure built entirely on performance is not a small thing. It's the place where the whole architecture becomes, for the first time, slightly untrustworthy, slightly unreliable, slightly less certain to hold the weight it was built to carry. And what this ultimately produces in a narcissist who will never admit it out loud, and may never even fully recognize it consciously, is a kind of haunting, not in the dramatic, gothic sense of the word, but in the quiet, persistent, psychological sense. The presence of something in the background of everything he does that simply wasn't there before. She haunts him not because she was perfect, or because the relationship was genuinely healthy, or because what they had together was the love story he might sometimes rewrite it as in memory. She haunts him because she was real. Because in a life built almost entirely on surfaces, on performances, on managing other people's perceptions of him, she represented something that couldn't be managed. A genuine encounter with someone who wouldn't be fooled, who couldn't be permanently deceived, who absorbed everything he brought her and eventually, quietly, clearly handed it back to him on her way out, essentially saying, "I see exactly what this is, and I choose better than this for myself." That moment of being chosen against, not out of confusion, not out of hurt, not from any failure to understand what he was, but from a complete and accurate understanding of exactly what he was, is the moment the narcissist can never quite move past, can't fully metabolize, can't spin into something that restores what it took from him. Because what it took wasn't just her presence in his life. It was the last remaining shred of his ability to fully believe his own performance. And without that real recovery, actual recovery, back to the version of himself that existed before she saw straight through it, isn't coming. It isn't something waiting somewhere down the road for him to eventually reach. It was permanently, quietly, irrevocably closed off the moment she walked out the door, carrying the truth of who he is more clearly than he has ever been able to carry it himself. What's strange, and worth sitting with for a moment, is that none of this required her to punish him, or expose him publicly, or say a single cruel word on her way out. The damage, if you can even call it that, wasn't something she did to him. It was something that happened simply by virtue of who she was and how completely she saw him. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need the last word. Her clarity was the last word, and it didn't need to be spoken to land with permanent force. This is, in a strange way, the quiet justice in stories like this one. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that shows up in a single confrontation or a viral moment of someone getting exactly what they deserve in front of an audience. It's slower than that and far more thorough. It's the justice of simply being known correctly by someone whose perception cannot be talked out of what it saw. For the superempath reading this, if any part of this resonates with something you've lived through, the point isn't to feel triumphant about someone else's private unraveling. It's to understand that your clarity, the very thing that may have made you feel almost cursed at times, too perceptive, too aware, too unable to look away from what was actually happening, was never a liability. It was the one thing he could never take from you, and ultimately the one thing he could never recover from either.